Monticello is often described as a monument to reason, a house built by a philosopher, shaped by Enlightenment ideals, and crowned with the language of liberty. But Monticello was also designed to hide something. Beneath its perfect symmetry and calm proportions lies a system built on silence, separation, and control. This is not just the story of a beautiful house, or even of Thomas Jefferson. It is the story of how America learned to speak about freedom before it learned how to live it. Monticello rises from the rolling Piedmont landscape of central Virginia with a studied calm that feels deliberate rather than grandiose. Set atop a low mountain ridge, the house does not dominate the land through sheer size or height, but through geometry, proportion, and control of perspective. From a distance, its pale brick walls and white classical details seem restrained, almost modest when compared to the European palaces that inspired its creator. Yet this restraint is itself a declaration. Monticello was conceived not as a seat of monarchy, but as a statement of rational order imposed upon nature. Its symmetry, its careful siting, and its commanding view across fields and forests express a belief central to the Enlightenment, that reason, when properly applied, could organize the world into a harmonious system. Thomas Jefferson chose this mountaintop not merely for beauty, but for surveillance, visibility, and symbolic elevation. From Monticello, the land unfolds outward in controlled layers, reinforcing the idea that authority flows from the house outward, shaping the space beneath it. The architecture of Monticello reflects Jefferson's deep engagement with classical antiquity and Renaissance humanism. Inspired heavily by the work of Andrea Palladio, particularly Palladio's villas in the Veneto, Jefferson adapted European forms to an American landscape. The low dome, unusual for a private residence in colonial America, crowns the house with a quiet intellectual ambition rather than royal extravagance. Columns, porticos, and balanced facades communicate stability and proportion, virtues prized by Enlightenment thinkers as reflections of a rational universe. Yet Monticello's classicism is selective. Jefferson did not replicate European aristocratic estates wholesale. Instead, he filtered them through an ideological lens that emphasized republican virtue over hereditary privilege. The house thus becomes an architectural argument, presenting itself as proof that refined culture and intellectual authority could exist without kings, titles, or inherited nobility. This argument, however, is inseparable from the physical organization of space around the house. Monticello's visible elegance conceals a complex network of service areas, workspaces, and labor zones deliberately hidden from view. Jefferson was acutely aware of sightlines. He designed terraces, pathways, and interior corridors to preserve the illusion of effortless order. Kitchens, storage rooms, workshops, and slave quarters were buried into the hillside or placed below the main living level. The effect was intentional. Visitors approaching Monticello encountered a serene, self-contained world where intellectual life appeared unburdened by manual labor. This spatial separation mirrors a deeper ideological division within Enlightenment society itself, where ideals of liberty and equality coexisted with rigid systems of exploitation that remained largely invisible to those who benefited from them. Monticello's interior continues this choreography of power and perception. Jefferson's entrance hall functions less as a domestic space than as a curated exhibition. Fossils, maps, Native American artifacts, and scientific instruments line the walls, transforming the house into a private museum of knowledge. These objects signal Jefferson's identity not simply as a landowner, but as a philosopher-statesman engaged in the global circulation of ideas. Every room reinforces the notion that reason, curiosity, and classification are the foundations of authority. Yet the very act of collecting and displaying these items also reflects imperial assumptions embedded within Enlightenment culture. The world is rendered legible, sortable, and controllable, its diversity reduced to objects arranged within a rational framework governed by a single mind. The relationship between Monticello and the surrounding plantation landscape further complicates this vision. Jefferson described himself as a gentleman farmer, and he devoted enormous attention to agricultural experimentation. Fields surrounding the mountain were organized into systems of crop rotation, erosion control, and soil management based on Enlightenment principles of improvement. Agriculture was not merely economic, it was moral and philosophical. To Jefferson, cultivating land responsibly was an extension of cultivating the mind. Yet the plantation economy that sustained Monticello depended on enslaved labor at every level. The serenity of the mountaintop was supported by hundreds of men, women, and children whose lives were constrained by force, whose movements were regulated, and whose labor generated the wealth that allowed Jefferson to pursue intellectual refinement. The physical distance between Monticello's refined spaces and the quarters at Mulberry Row, the plantation's industrial center, was not accidental. Mulberry Row housed workshops, naileries, storage buildings, and slave dwellings, forming the economic engine of the estate. From the main house, these structures were largely hidden by terrain and vegetation. This spatial arrangement ensured that the daily realities of coerced labor did not intrude upon the philosophical calm of Jefferson's domestic world. The landscape itself became a mechanism of denial, allowing Enlightenment ideals to exist in isolation from the human cost required to sustain them. Architecture here does not merely reflect ideology, it actively enforces it. Monticello was not static. Jefferson redesigned and rebuilt the house repeatedly over decades, altering its proportions, adding and removing elements, refining its systems. These revisions reveal a restless intellect perpetually dissatisfied with imperfection, but they also expose the fragility of the Enlightenment project when applied to lived reality. Each improvement required additional resources, additional labor, and additional debt. Jefferson's commitment to aesthetic and intellectual ideals repeatedly outpaced his financial capacity. The house that symbolized rational order was constructed through cycles of borrowing and expansion that undermined the very stability it was meant to represent. As the sun moves across the Virginia sky, Monticello's carefully calibrated spaces shift in light and shadow, revealing the subtle theatricality of its design. Windows frame the landscape like paintings, emphasizing harmony between human creation and the natural world. Yet this harmony is curated, controlled, and selective. What remains unseen is as important as what is displayed. The house stands as a material embodiment of Enlightenment confidence, but also of Enlightenment blindness. Its beauty is real, its intellectual ambition undeniable, but its serenity is achieved through exclusion, concealment, and hierarchy. Monticello endures today not only as a preserved architectural masterpiece, but as a question posed in brick, wood, and stone. It asks whether ideals can be separated from the structures that sustain them, and whether reason alone is sufficient to resolve moral contradiction. In its proportions and vistas, Monticello presents an image of balance and clarity. In its foundations and hidden corridors, it reveals the cost of maintaining that image. This tension, embedded in space itself, sets the stage for the broader contradictions that would define both Jefferson's life and the American Enlightenment he helped shape. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Monticello cannot be separated from his formation as an Enlightenment thinker shaped by transatlantic currents of philosophy, science, and political theory. Born into the Virginia planter elite in 1743, Jefferson inherited land, enslaved laborers, and social position long before he earned distinction as a revolutionary intellectual. His education at the College of William and Mary exposed him to classical texts, natural philosophy, and legal reasoning, grounding him in the belief that human affairs could be governed by rational principles rather than divine right or inherited authority. Monticello emerged from this intellectual inheritance as a physical extension of Jefferson's mind, a place where ideas were not merely written or debated, but spatially enacted. The house functioned as a laboratory for Enlightenment living, where architecture, agriculture, and daily routines were organized according to systems Jefferson believed reflected universal order. Jefferson's commitment to Enlightenment ideals was genuine and sustained. He read widely, corresponded with European intellectuals, and participated actively in the Republic of Letters. His library, later sold to Congress to replace the volumes lost when the British burned Washington in 1814, reflected the breadth of his interests, ranging from political theory and classical history to botany, engineering, and linguistics. Monticello was designed to house this intellectual life. Alcoves, studies, and reading nooks were integrated into domestic spaces, dissolving boundaries between private reflection and public responsibility. Knowledge in Jefferson's worldview was not ornamental, it was the foundation of legitimate authority. This belief would find its most famous expression in the Declaration of Independence, where Enlightenment language of natural rights and human equality was elevated to a national creed. Yet the distance between Jefferson's ideals and his lived reality was never merely abstract. At Monticello, this contradiction became daily, physical, and unavoidable. While Jefferson articulated the principle that all men are created equal, he simultaneously owned hundreds of enslaved people over the course of his life. This was not an anomaly within his social class, but Jefferson's prominence as an Enlightenment moralist placed his actions under a harsher historical light. The plantation economy that sustained Monticello relied on a rigid racial hierarchy enforced through violence, surveillance, and coercion. Enslaved families lived under constant threat of sale, punishment, and separation. Their labor extracted to fund the intellectual and political pursuits that Jefferson believed would advance human liberty. The architecture of Monticello facilitated this moral separation. Enslaved workers moved through hidden corridors, underground passages, and service routes designed to minimize their presence in the main household. This invisibility was functional as well as symbolic. It allowed Jefferson to maintain the illusion that rational order could exist independently of the brutal systems that underwrote it. Enlightenment philosophy often assumed that reason would naturally lead to moral progress. Yet Monticello demonstrates how reason could also be compartmentalized, selectively applied, and insulated from inconvenient truths. Jefferson's writings reveal his awareness of slavery's injustice, yet his actions reveal a persistent inability or unwillingness to dismantle the system from which he benefited. Financial records from Monticello further complicate Jefferson's self-image as a rational steward. Despite his advocacy for fiscal responsibility and independence, Jefferson lived perpetually beyond his means. The costs of building and maintaining Monticello, combined with fluctuating agricultural markets and chronic debt, undermined his economic stability. He borrowed extensively, often against the future labor of enslaved people, transforming human lives into financial collateral. This reliance on credit reveals a paradox at the heart of Enlightenment modernity. The pursuit of improvement and refinement often depended on speculative finance and deferred moral reckoning. Monticello's elegance was sustained not by self-sufficiency, but by networks of debt that mirrored the emerging capitalist structures of the Atlantic world. Jefferson's political career intensified these contradictions rather than resolving them. As governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, diplomat in France, Secretary of State, Vice President, and eventually President of the United States, Jefferson wielded immense influence over the shape of the new republic. His time in France deepened his appreciation for Enlightenment culture while exposing him to the excesses of European aristocracy. Ironically, it was in Paris that Jefferson refined many of the architectural ideas later realized at Monticello, even as he witnessed the social inequalities that would soon erupt into revolution. The lessons he drew from France emphasized Republican simplicity, yet Monticello continued to grow more elaborate, reflecting the difficulty of translating political ideals into personal restraint. The contradiction between Jefferson's public advocacy for liberty and his private dependence on slavery was not lost on his contemporaries. Critics both during and after his lifetime pointed to the moral inconsistency embedded within his legacy. Jefferson himself expressed fear that slavery would bring divine judgment upon the nation, yet he deferred responsibility to future generations. Monticello thus becomes a site of postponement, where moral clarity was acknowledged intellectually but delayed indefinitely in practice. The house stands as evidence of how Enlightenment optimism about progress could coexist with profound ethical inertia. Within the walls of Monticello, this postponement shaped daily life. Enslaved artisans, including skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, and nail makers, contributed directly to the estate's construction and profitability. Their craftsmanship is embedded in the structure itself, even as their names were largely excluded from the historical record for generations. The Enlightenment emphasis on authorship and individual genius obscured the collective labor that made Monticello possible. Jefferson's architectural vision, celebrated for its originality, was realized through the forced work of people denied recognition, compensation, or autonomy. The house thus embodies a hierarchy of value, where intellectual contribution was exalted while physical labor was rendered invisible. Monticello's contradictions are not merely personal failings. They reflect structural tensions within the American Enlightenment itself. The revolutionary generation embraced universal principles while operating within a world shaped by empire, slavery, and land dispossession. Jefferson's life illustrates how Enlightenment thought could challenge inherited authority while simultaneously reinforcing new forms of domination. Monticello, as both home and symbol, captures this duality with unsettling clarity. It invites admiration for its intellectual ambition while demanding confrontation with the systems that sustained it. As Jefferson aged, the gap between ideal and reality widened. Debt accumulated, the plantation economy stagnated, and the moral contradictions he had long deferred grew more pronounced. Monticello remained outwardly serene, but beneath its ordered surfaces lay unresolved tensions that would outlive its creator. The house did not collapse under the weight of these contradictions, but it preserved them, embedding them into the national memory. In this sense, Monticello functions not only as a monument to Enlightenment ideals, but as an archive of their limits. The final decades of Thomas Jefferson's life unfolded in the shadow of contradictions he never resolved, and Monticello became the stage upon which those tensions hardened into legacy. After leaving the presidency in 1809, Jefferson returned permanently to the mountain he had shaped for more than 40 years. The nation he helped found was expanding westward, its political institutions stabilizing, its Enlightenment language firmly embedded in civic life. Yet Jefferson himself was increasingly constrained by financial precarity and moral compromise. Monticello, outwardly serene and intellectually ordered, concealed a reality of mounting debt, aging infrastructure, and an enslaved community whose lives remained bound to Jefferson's inability to reconcile principle with practice. Jefferson's post-presidential years were marked by an almost obsessive return to intellectual projects. He founded the University of Virginia, designing its architecture, curriculum, and governance according to Enlightenment ideals of secular education and civic virtue. The university's layout echoed Monticello's spatial philosophy: pavilions arranged around a central lawn, knowledge ordered through symmetry and proportion, authority diffused through reason rather than imposed by force. Yet once again, these ideals were implemented within a society that relied on enslaved labor to function. The university itself was constructed and maintained by enslaved workers, replicating on an institutional scale the same contradictions that defined Monticello. Jefferson's Enlightenment vision expanded, but its moral foundations remained compromised. At Monticello, daily life grew increasingly constrained. Jefferson's debts, accrued through decades of construction, consumption, and agricultural shortfalls, could no longer be deferred. He continued to borrow, often using enslaved people as collateral, converting human lives into financial instruments within an Atlantic credit system that treated bodies as assets. This practice was not unique to Jefferson, but its presence at Monticello underscores the gap between Enlightenment abstractions and economic reality. The house that symbolized rational independence was sustained through dependence on systems of exploitation that Jefferson publicly acknowledged as unjust yet privately perpetuated. The enslaved community at Monticello experienced these pressures acutely. Families lived with the constant threat of sale as Jefferson attempted to manage his finances. Skilled laborers were pushed to increase productivity, particularly in the nailery, where enslaved boys were forced to meet quotas under harsh supervision. These practices expose a darker dimension of Enlightenment rationality: efficiency without empathy, calculation divorced from moral accountability. Monticello's order was not merely aesthetic, it was disciplinary, enforcing productivity through control while preserving the appearance of benevolent governance. Jefferson's death in 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, sealed the symbolic weight of his legacy. The coincidence was widely remarked upon, reinforcing Jefferson's image as an embodiment of the nation's founding ideals. Yet the immediate aftermath of his death revealed the fragility of the world he left behind. Monticello, burdened by debt, could not remain intact. Jefferson's heirs were forced to sell the estate and auction off enslaved people who had lived and labored there for generations. Families were separated, histories fractured, and the community that had sustained Monticello was dismantled to satisfy creditors. The Enlightenment promise of posterity collided with the brutal mechanics of property law. The dispersal of Monticello's enslaved population marks one of the most consequential moments in the estate's history. For decades, the house had functioned as a closed system, preserving the illusion of stability. The auction shattered that illusion, revealing the human cost embedded within its walls. Monticello's architecture endured, but the social world that animated it was irrevocably altered. Enlightenment ideals, so carefully articulated in Jefferson's writings, offered no protection to those whose lives were rendered disposable by his financial failure. In the years that followed, Monticello passed through multiple owners, each imprinting new meanings onto the structure. The house gradually transitioned from private residence to historical artifact, its significance reframed within a national narrative of founding and progress. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, preservation efforts emphasized Jefferson's genius while minimizing the centrality of slavery to the estate's operation. Monticello became a shrine to Enlightenment achievement, its contradictions softened by selective memory. This process of historical curation mirrored broader patterns in American public history, where ideals were celebrated and costs obscured. The 20th century restoration of Monticello intensified this tension. As curators and historians sought to return the house to its Jefferson-era appearance, decisions about interpretation carried moral weight. Which stories would be told and which would remain peripheral? Early narratives focused on architecture, invention, and political philosophy, reinforcing Jefferson's status as an Enlightenment hero. Only gradually did scholarship and public interpretation begin to integrate the lives of the enslaved into Monticello's story, acknowledging that the house's elegance was inseparable from their labor. This shift reflects a broader reevaluation of Enlightenment legacies, not as pure triumphs of reason, but as complex systems shaped by power and exclusion. Monticello today stands at the intersection of admiration and reckoning. Its architecture continues to inspire, its intellectual ambition undeniable, yet its meaning has changed. The house no longer functions solely as a testament to Enlightenment harmony. It has become a site of inquiry into the moral limits of that tradition. Visitors encounter not only Jefferson's ideas, but the evidence of lives constrained by those ideas' incomplete application. Monticello thus embodies a national struggle to reconcile founding principles with historical reality. The contradictions embedded in Monticello are not relics of a distant past. They resonate in ongoing debates about freedom, inequality, and the responsibilities of power. Enlightenment ideals remain foundational to American identity, yet their implementation has always been uneven. Monticello reveals how architecture, landscape, and daily practice can both express and conceal moral tension. It demonstrates that reason, when divorced from accountability, can coexist with profound injustice. In the end, Monticello does not offer resolution, it offers clarity. Its beauty draws the eye upward, toward balance and proportion. Its history pulls attention downward, toward foundations built on coerced labor and deferred justice. The house endures as a material record of the American Enlightenment's promise and its failure, a reminder that ideals gain meaning only when measured against the lives they shape. Monticello's forgotten story is not forgotten because it lacks evidence, but because confronting it requires acknowledging that the nation's most eloquent language of liberty emerged from spaces structured by inequality. The modern afterlife of Monticello reveals how historical memory itself becomes an arena of power, shaped by choices about preservation, interpretation, and silence. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States sought physical anchors for its national story, and Monticello emerged as one of its most potent symbols. The house offered something rare, a tangible link between Enlightenment philosophy and American statehood, embodied in brick and timber rather than abstract text. Yet this symbolic elevation required careful framing. Monticello could not easily be celebrated without confronting the institution of slavery that sustained it. And for decades, that confrontation was deferred. The house was preserved as an intellectual monument. While the lives of the enslaved were relegated to the margins of interpretation, their presence acknowledged only in passing, if at all. Early preservation efforts focused almost exclusively on Jefferson's architectural ingenuity and scientific curiosity. Restoration emphasized Palladian symmetry, innovative mechanical devices, and Jefferson's role as a polymath statesman. This selective narrative aligned with a broader national desire to present the founding era as a moral high point, unified by shared ideals rather than fractured by contradiction. Monticello's restored rooms appeared serene, rational, and orderly, reinforcing the image of Enlightenment harmony. Yet this harmony was curated. The physical spaces associated with enslaved life, including workyards and quarters, were often left unmarked or underexplored, reinforcing the same spatial erasures Jefferson himself had designed. The gradual shift toward fuller historical reckoning at Monticello reflects changes in American historiography as much as changes at the site itself. As scholarship on slavery, race, and power expanded in the mid to late 20th century, Monticello could no longer be interpreted solely as a monument to intellectual achievement. Archaeological work along Mulberry Row uncovered material evidence of enslaved families' lives, revealing patterns of domesticity, resilience, and suffering long absent from official narratives. These findings challenge earlier interpretations that frame slavery as a peripheral feature rather than a central pillar of Monticello's operation. The Enlightenment ideal of reasoned inquiry, ironically, provided the tools that would dismantle its own sanitized myth. The inclusion of enslaved voices into Monticello's story transformed the meaning of the house. It became possible to understand Monticello not as a contradiction to be resolved, but as a system to be examined. Jefferson's writings, once read primarily for philosophical clarity, were re-examined alongside plantation records, letters, and account books. The result was a more complex portrait of Enlightenment thought and practice, one that acknowledged moral awareness without moral action. Monticello emerged as evidence that intellectual brilliance does not guarantee ethical courage, and that systemic injustice can persist even when its injustice is recognized by those who benefit from it. Public interpretation at Monticello began to evolve accordingly. Tours increasingly incorporated discussions of enslaved labor, family life, and resistance, situating Jefferson within the social realities he navigated and perpetuated. This shift did not diminish Monticello's significance. It deepened it. The house became a site of dialogue rather than reverence, inviting visitors to grapple with uncomfortable questions about national origins. In this sense, Monticello's meaning aligned more closely with Enlightenment principles than earlier celebratory narratives ever had. Honest inquiry replaced idealized myth, and complexity replaced simplicity. Yet even this reckoning reveals limits. Interpretation, no matter how thorough, cannot restore what was lost. Families broken apart after Jefferson's death could not be reunited by historical acknowledgement. Lives constrained by slavery cannot be redeemed through scholarship alone. Monticello's role as a museum underscores the distance between understanding and justice. The Enlightenment emphasis on knowledge as a path to improvement is tested here, confronted by the reality that awareness does not automatically produce repair. Monticello stands as proof that moral progress requires not only reason, but accountability and action. The contradictions embodied by Monticello extend beyond Jefferson and his era. They resonate in modern debates about monuments, memory, and national identity. How should societies honor intellectual achievements while acknowledging the harm intertwined with them? Monticello offers no simple answer. Its continued preservation reflects a belief that confronting complexity is preferable to erasing it. The house remains intact not because it represents moral perfection, but because it preserves evidence of moral struggle embedded in the nation's foundations. Architecturally, Monticello continues to communicate Jefferson's belief in order and balance. Its proportions remain persuasive, its innovations impressive, yet knowledge of its history alters the experience of its spaces. The hidden corridors no longer feel merely clever, they feel intentional. The buried service areas no longer read as efficient design choices alone. They reveal a worldview structured around hierarchy and control. Enlightenment architecture, once celebrated as an expression of universal reason, is revealed as a tool capable of reinforcing social divisions, even as it proclaims equality. In this way, Monticello functions as a mirror held up to the American Enlightenment itself. The movement's language of liberty, reason, and progress remains foundational, but its application was partial and compromised. Monticello captures this truth in physical form. It demonstrates how ideals can be sincerely held, yet selectively applied, and how systems of power adapt to absorb critique without relinquishing control. Jefferson's belief that slavery would eventually fade under the light of reason proved overly optimistic, not because reason was absent, but because power resisted its implications. As visitors stand on Monticello's terraces today, the landscape appears much as Jefferson intended, ordered, expansive, and serene. Yet the knowledge of what lies beneath that serenity reshapes perception. The mountain becomes less a place of escape and more a site of confrontation, where admiration and discomfort coexist. Monticello endures not because it resolves the contradictions of American Enlightenment, but because it preserves them, offering future generations the opportunity to examine how ideals are lived, compromised, and remembered. In this preservation of contradiction lies Monticello's enduring significance. It is neither a shrine nor a condemnation, but a record. It documents what happens when intellectual ambition outpaces moral action, and when reason is used to justify order without justice. The forgotten story of Monticello is not hidden in archives. It is embedded in space itself, waiting to be seen by those willing to look beyond the facade. The story of Monticello ultimately forces a reconsideration of what the American Enlightenment was able to achieve and what it failed to confront. Jefferson believed deeply that history moved toward improvement, guided by education, rational debate, and the gradual refinement of institutions. This faith in progress shaped not only his politics, but his approach to time itself. Monticello was designed to endure, to stand as a lesson to future generations about how reason could be embedded into daily life. Yet endurance can preserve contradictions as easily as it preserves ideals. Monticello survived because its physical form was valued, even as the human structures that sustained it were dismantled and forgotten. The tension between permanence and fragility is central to Monticello's meaning. Jefferson imagined the house as a stable anchor for enlightened citizenship, yet it was economically unsustainable. Its survival depended not on Jefferson's careful planning, but on later acts of preservation driven by national myth-making. This disconnect mirrors the broader Enlightenment belief that good ideas naturally create durable systems. Monticello reveals how ideas, no matter how compelling, require ethical alignment with material realities if they are to endure without distortion. When that alignment fails, structures persist unevenly, preserving form while hollowing out substance. In the 19th century, as the United States grappled with civil war and emancipation, Monticello's contradictions gained new resonance. The ideals Jefferson articulated were invoked by both defenders and critics of slavery, demonstrating the malleability of Enlightenment language. Monticello, silent but present, stood as evidence that founding principles could be stretched to justify opposing moral claims. This flexibility did not weaken Enlightenment ideals. It exposed their dependence on interpretation and power. Without sustained moral commitment, reason alone proved insufficient to guide the nation through its deepest conflicts. The legacy of Monticello thus complicates simple narratives of American exceptionalism. It shows that the nation's intellectual foundations were neither purely liberating nor wholly oppressive, but structurally conflicted. Jefferson's belief in universal rights coexisted with practices that denied those rights to many. Monticello does not resolve this contradiction, it records it. Its endurance ensures that the American Enlightenment cannot be remembered as a finished project, but as an ongoing argument between principle and practice. For the descendants of those enslaved at Monticello, this legacy carries particular weight. Their ancestors' labor built and maintained a symbol of liberty from which they were excluded. Recognition of this fact reshapes Monticello from a static monument into a contested space where historical authority is renegotiated. Enlightenment values of inquiry and evidence now demand inclusion of voices once silenced. In this sense, Monticello continues to evolve, not architecturally, but interpretively, reflecting a broader societal shift toward confronting uncomfortable truths. This evolution underscores a final irony. Jefferson believed that reason, once articulated, would inevitably guide moral progress. Monticello demonstrates instead that progress requires continual re-examination and the willingness to revise inherited narratives. The house endures not because it embodies resolved ideals, but because it exposes unresolved ones. Its preservation allows each generation to test Enlightenment promises against historical evidence, revealing gaps between aspiration and reality. Monticello's forgotten story is therefore not a footnote to Jefferson's legacy. It is central to understanding it. The house stands at the intersection of brilliance and blindness, offering neither absolution nor condemnation, but context. It shows how Enlightenment ideals shaped a nation while failing to transform the structures that contradicted them. In doing so, Monticello invites a more mature engagement with history, one that accepts complexity without retreating into cynicism. As the American Enlightenment continues to influence debates about democracy, equality, and power, Monticello remains a quiet but insistent presence. Its architecture speaks of order and harmony. Its history speaks of exclusion and compromise. Together, they form a record of a society learning to articulate freedom before learning how to practice it. Monticello endures not as a finished statement, but as an open question, reminding us that ideals gain meaning only when measured against the lives they shape and the responsibilities they demand. In the final assessment, Monticello stands as one of the most revealing physical records of how power, ideals, and memory interact over time. Unlike battlefields or legislative halls, its authority is quiet and persistent. It persuades through beauty, balance, and calm, encouraging admiration before inquiry. This subtlety is precisely why Monticello remains so influential within the American historical imagination. It demonstrates how Enlightenment ideals were not imposed through force alone, but through environments carefully designed to normalize hierarchy while proclaiming liberty. Monticello teaches not by instruction, but by atmosphere, shaping perception through space long after its creator's voice has fallen silent. The American Enlightenment often presented itself as a clean break from European aristocracy, grounded in merit rather than lineage. Monticello complicates this claim. Jefferson rejected hereditary titles, yet lived as a landed elite whose authority rested on property, debt, and coerced labor. The House reflects this continuity. Though Republican in symbolism, it operated within social and economic structures that mirrored the old world more than Jefferson was willing to admit. Monticello thus exposes how revolutions can alter language and governance while leaving deeper hierarchies intact. Enlightenment republicanism reshaped power's justification, not always its distribution. This realization carries implications far beyond Jefferson's lifetime. The United States inherited Enlightenment ideals without fully dismantling the systems that contradicted them. Monticello's survival into the present ensures that this inheritance remains visible. Each restoration choice, interpretive update, and scholarly intervention becomes part of an ongoing negotiation over national identity. The House does not belong solely to Jefferson's era. It belongs to every generation that chooses how to remember the founding. In this sense, Monticello is not static history, but active historical practice. The emotional restraint of Monticello's architecture mirrors the emotional restraint of Enlightenment thought itself. Jefferson valued composure, moderation, and balance, distrusting excess of passion as a threat to reason. Yet passion, suppressed rather than addressed, often re-emerges in destructive forms. The lives of the enslaved at Monticello reveal how suppressed injustice accumulates pressure. Their resistance, resilience, and survival challenge the notion that order alone produces stability. Monticello's calm exterior thus conceals historical forces that Enlightenment reason could neither fully contain nor resolve. The House's endurance into the 21st century invites comparison with modern institutions shaped by Enlightenment ideals. Universities, courts, and democratic governments still rely on the language of reason, equality, and progress. Monticello reminds us that these institutions, like the House itself, must be examined not only for what they claim to represent, but for whom they serve. Enlightenment ideals remain powerful precisely because they invite scrutiny. When applied honestly, they expose their own failures as clearly as their successes. Monticello's significance, then, lies not in providing answers, but in preserving evidence. It records how ideals were lived imperfectly, how moral awareness coexisted with moral compromise, and how beauty was constructed alongside suffering. This record does not diminish Jefferson's intellectual contributions, but it places them within the full context of their consequences. Monticello insists that historical greatness be measured not only by words written or buildings designed, but by lives affected. In confronting Monticello's contradictions, a deeper understanding of the American Enlightenment emerges. It was neither a hollow myth nor a completed triumph, but an unfinished project shaped by human limitation. Jefferson's faith in reason was sincere, yet incomplete without structural change. Monticello embodies this incompleteness, standing as a reminder that ideals require continual renewal if they are to move beyond aspiration into practice. As evening settles over the mountain, Monticello's silhouette softens against the Virginia sky. The house appears tranquil, timeless, and resolved. Yet its history resists closure. The Enlightenment contradictions embedded within its walls continue to challenge viewers to look beyond surfaces and question inherited narratives. Monticello endures not because it resolves the tensions of American history, but because it preserves them, offering future generations the opportunity to confront the costs of power, the limits of reason, and the enduring gap between what a society believes and what it does. Monticello's enduring presence forces a final, quieter reckoning with the nature of historical inheritance. Enlightenment thinkers believed that future generations would judge the past with increasing clarity, armed with better knowledge and freer institutions. Jefferson trusted posterity, even when he deferred action in his own time. Monticello, preserved and studied, has indeed allowed later generations to see more clearly than Jefferson perhaps anticipated. Yet clarity has not brought closure. Instead, it has revealed how deeply contradiction is woven into the foundations of American political and cultural life. The American Enlightenment did not fail because it lacked moral insight. Jefferson understood the injustice of slavery and articulated its dangers with remarkable candor. Its failure lay in the belief that recognition alone was sufficient, that time and reason would inevitably dissolve injustice without direct sacrifice. Monticello demonstrates how this belief allowed power to persist unchanged. The house stands as a material lesson in the limits of moral patience. Reason delayed can become reason denied, and ideals postponed can harden into justifications for inaction. This lesson extends beyond Jefferson and slavery. Monticello illustrates how institutions built on noble principles can drift away from their ethical foundations while maintaining outward legitimacy. Architecture, ritual, and tradition can sustain authority even as underlying realities contradict stated values. Enlightenment ideals remain compelling precisely because they demand alignment between belief and behavior. Monticello shows what happens when that alignment is incomplete. It becomes possible to admire reason while tolerating injustice, to celebrate liberty while accepting inequality as temporary or necessary. The ongoing reinterpretation of Monticello suggests that Enlightenment thought still exerts moral pressure on the present. Each generation returns to the house with new questions shaped by contemporary concerns about power, race, and democracy. Monticello absorbs these questions without resolving them, functioning as a historical conscience rather than a moral verdict. Its survival ensures that the American Enlightenment remains open to interrogation, its promises measured against evidence rather than rhetoric. In this sense, Monticello's value lies not in reconciliation, but in discomfort. It resists simple narratives of progress or decline, offering instead a layered account of ambition constrained by circumstance and choice. Jefferson's life and work reveal how far Enlightenment ideas could reach and how easily they could stop short of transformation. Monticello preserves a stopping point in physical form, marking the boundary between aspiration and action. As historical scholarship continues to evolve, Monticello's story will likely grow more complex rather than more settled. New evidence, new voices, and new interpretive frameworks will continue to reshape understanding of the house and its inhabitants. This openness aligns paradoxically with Enlightenment values themselves. Genuine reason invites revision. Monticello's willingness to be reinterpreted reflects the enduring power of inquiry over certainty. Ultimately, Monticello asks whether a society can honor its ideals without confronting the systems that contradict them. The American Enlightenment provided a language of freedom that reshaped the world. But Monticello reminds us that language alone does not dismantle hierarchy. It reveals the cost of believing that moral progress is inevitable rather than constructed. The house endures as a quiet warning that ideals must be enacted, not merely articulated, if they are to reshape lived reality. Monticello's forgotten story is therefore not a story of hypocrisy alone, but of human limitation. It captures the tension between what people know and what they are willing to relinquish. In preserving that tension, Monticello remains one of the most honest monuments in American history. It does not celebrate victory or condemn failure. It records the unfinished work of aligning power with principle, a task that continues long after the Enlightenment's words were written into law. When Monticello is viewed across the full sweep of American history, its power lies not in resolution, but in continuity. The house has outlived revolutions, wars, economic transformations, and ideological shifts, remaining present as each generation redefines the meaning of liberty, equality, and authority. Enlightenment thinkers believed that institutions shaped by reason would naturally improve over time. Monticello complicates this assumption. It shows that endurance alone does not guarantee moral progress. Structures can persist while the contradictions within them remain unresolved, passed forward rather than corrected. The American Enlightenment promised that knowledge would liberate societies from inherited injustice. Monticello demonstrates how knowledge can coexist with constraint when power is unwilling to surrender its advantages. Jefferson's brilliance did not prevent him from participating in systems he knew to be wrong. The house he designed reflects this duality with unsettling clarity. Its order and beauty invite admiration, but its history demands interrogation. Monticello insists that intellectual achievement be measured alongside ethical consequence, and that national origins be examined without reverence or erasure. This insistence reshapes how the founding era itself is understood. Rather than a moment of pure principle later compromised, the American Enlightenment emerges as a movement shaped from its inception by contradiction. Monticello was never a deviation from that pattern. It was its embodiment. The house illustrates how ideals can be sincere and limited at the same time, expansive in language, yet constrained in application. Enlightenment thought provided a vocabulary for freedom, but Monticello reveals how difficult it was to extend that freedom beyond those already positioned to claim it. In preserving Monticello, the nation preserves evidence of this difficulty. The site's continued relevance lies in its refusal to simplify. It does not allow the American Enlightenment to be remembered as a completed triumph, nor dismissed as mere hypocrisy. Instead, it presents a record of ambition restrained by fear, comfort, and compromise. Monticello's legacy is thus inseparable from the ongoing project of American democracy, which continues to wrestle with the gap between declared ideals and lived reality. The house also clarifies the relationship between power and morality. Jefferson believed that moral enlightenment would follow political independence, yet Monticello shows how independence can coexist with domination. Power, once secured, tends to protect itself, even when its holders recognize its injustice. Enlightenment reason, without structural change, proved insufficient to dismantle systems that rewarded delay. Monticello stands as a cautionary example of how ethical insight can be neutralized by convenience and inheritance. As a historical artifact, Monticello now operates differently than it once did. It no longer conceals labor or hierarchy, it exposes them. The very spaces designed to hide dependency now serve as points of inquiry. This reversal reflects a broader transformation in historical consciousness, one that values evidence over myth and complexity over comfort. In this way, Monticello fulfills an Enlightenment function Jefferson himself could not complete. It becomes a site where reason interrogates power rather than adorns it. The forgotten story of Monticello is therefore not forgotten because it was inaccessible, but because acknowledging it unsettles foundational narratives. To confront Monticello honestly is to accept that the language of liberty emerged from spaces structured by inequality, and that moral progress has never been automatic. This acceptance does not weaken Enlightenment ideals, it grounds them. It reminds us that principles gain force only when they are enacted consistently, even when doing so demands sacrifice. Monticello endures as a testament to this unfinished work. Its mountain setting suggests clarity and perspective. Yet its history resists closure. The house remains not as an answer, but as an invitation to examine how ideals are lived, constrained, and remembered. In preserving Monticello, The nation preserves the opportunity to measure its present against its past, and to ask whether the contradictions that shaped its founding continue to shape its future. In the end, Monticello stands as one of the most honest monuments in American history precisely because it does not resolve the contradictions it embodies. It records them. It holds together reason and blindness, aspiration and delay, beauty and coercion. The American Enlightenment spoke eloquently about freedom, but Monticello reveals how difficult freedom was to practice fully. That difficulty, preserved in wood and stone, remains its most enduring lesson.